The tapping starts after the room has gone quiet. There's a bed against one wall, a chair pulled close, a basin on a little table, and a lamp turned low because nobody wants the sick person waking in a fright. The window is cracked for air, but the room is still warm. Old houses hold heat in their boards long after the day is gone, especially in the upper rooms where illness has kept everybody nervous and half awake. That's what you do in a room like that. You listen for the next breath and then the next one, and then you realize the whole house has started listening with you. The fire has burned down. The floor has stopped creaking under people's feet. Even the whispered prayers have gone thin because after a while, there's only so much a family can say without repeating itself. Then it comes from the wall beside the bed. A small dry tick inside the wood, followed by another, only a few seconds later. At first, the person in the chair blames the boards, because houses make their own sounds at night. Beams settle and plaster shifts. Mice can find places they have no business being, and old furniture can pop in the heat for no reason. But this sound keeps its own pace. Tick, tick, tick. It comes from inside the paneling, low and steady, close enough to the bed that everyone in the room can hear it once they know what to listen for. Somebody lifts their head. Somebody else turns towards the wall. The sick person may sleep through it, but the watchers don't, and that's the problem. A sound that would pass unnoticed at dinner becomes a warning during a bedside vigil. In an older house with old oak and old beams and a family already afraid of what morning might bring, that little tapping could stop the room cold. Sometimes it came when someone was already ill. Sometimes it came before anyone knew a death might be walking towards them. People believed it was counting down, and once a sound like that was named, the family heard the house differently forever. I'm Papa G, and this is the Feral Folklorist. And today we're talking about the Deathwatch beetle, the old belief that a faint tapping in the wall could warn a household that death was already on its way. The Deathwatch beetle is one of those creatures whose name is larger than its body. The insect most often met in Britain, and forgive me if I get this pronunciation wrong, is Extobium rufovillisum. All right, that was a mouthful. But it is a small wood-boring beetle, and it's usually dark brown and mottled with pale golden hairs, only a few millimeters long. You could miss it easily if it crossed a floorboard. But if it's inside old wood at night and the house is quiet enough, that little creature can sound like somebody tapping from the other side of the wall. In the wild, it belongs in dead wood. That matters because the beetle came to human houses through ordinary wood, not through some special love of haunted bedrooms or old church beams. It was doing what a beetle does. It's breaking down old timber and using dead and decaying wood as a place to live and feed and breed. The trouble began when human beings built houses and chapels and furniture and barns and ships out of the same material that the beetle already liked. To the beetle, an old oak beam in a house was dinner and a shelter. The adults make the sound that gave the insect its reputation. The tapping comes from inside the wood and can sound like a small watch ticking or a fingernail striking a board from the wrong side. Most entomologists described it as communication, especially around mating time. The beetle is calling through the timber. People in earlier centuries heard the same sound in a sickroom, or a quiet kitchen, or a parlor, or a dark bedroom, and reached for the explanation that made sense inside their world, that death was coming close. That name, Deathwatch, matters because a watch was also something people did. A family kept watch beside someone who was dying. They sat in shifts, sometimes through the night, listening for breathing, watching their face, waiting for a change of some sort while they were praying, or whispering, or trying to decide whether to wake the rest of the house if something happened. In that setting, a steady tick inside the wall starts to feel like a message. One of the strongest early witnesses is Sir Thomas Browne, the 17th century English physician and writer. In 1646, he wrote a book on common errors and false beliefs, and Browne wrote that the death watch was a clicking sound people heard in rooms and took as a prediction of death. He wasn't trying to make the story a spooky one, but Browne was trying to calm people down, which is a very 17th century doctorly thing to do. He was, in plain language, trying to say, please stop panicking. The doom bug is just an insect. Browne said the sound was made by a small gray insect found in wainscot, benches, and woodwork in summer. That little list tells you where people met the omen. Wainscot meant wood paneling, and benches meant seats people used every single day. So the death watch came from the same wall a bed might be pushed against, or the same bench someone might sit on, and the same paneling a family passed every single day. Browne had apparently collected the insects and listened to them himself. He said they worked best in warm weather and knocked several times in a run. He also knew who got frightened by them, people already worn down by sickness in a house, especially those watching over children. That gives us one clear setting for the belief. The beetle made a sound at the worst possible time, when death was already on people's minds. The belief also worked outside the sick room. Before electric lights, people went to bed with the dark unless sickness or childbirth or grief or danger kept them awake. The ordinary night had fewer machines in it, so it was quieter. Fire, weather, and animals, and human breath even stood out more clearly if you were awake at 2 a.m. There was a possible reason for it, and repeating tap from inside a timber could feel very personal even before anyone in the house had fallen ill. You thought something was going to happen. The Deathwatch had a nasty advantage over many omens. You could hear it without seeing it. If you saw a black dog at the lane, which was another sign, you might be able to doubt that one, or a bird striking the window could be explained. A ticking sound inside a wall gives you very little to argue with. The creature stays out of sight, and the house seems to be doing the warning for them. That's why the idea traveled so easily into literature. Mark Twain used it in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, where Tom hears the ghastly ticking of the death watch near the bed and shudders because it means somebody's days are numbered. Edgar Allan Poe gives us death watches in the wall in The Telltale Heart, though that line has been read more than one way because more than one tiny insect carried death watch beliefs with them. That actually helps us understand the superstition better. The exact creature could shift, but the old fear stayed with the sound. A hidden ticking in the wall meant death was near. In practical magic, the Deathwatch beetle works the way folklore often uses small creatures, as a warning that sounds ridiculous until it happens in your own house. The beetle in that story doesn't simply confirm a sickroom death, it warns that a loved man is doomed. That's the broader version of the omen. It's the version that makes people listen a little bit harder. The tapping comes first, and the grief comes later. So, in the beginning of the movie in Practical Magic, they're actually explaining to the girls about their parents' death. And Aunt Frances says, she heard the beetle ticking for your father's death all day long. And she knew that when you hear the sound of the death watch beetle, the man you love is doomed to die. Now, there's also the practical side, and here the beetle becomes more than just superstition. Deathwatch beetles can damage old timber. The larvae feed inside the wood, and the signs may be small round exit holes, little pellets of frass, and a faint sound that only shows itself when the room settles. So the old name carries two kinds of warnings. Folklore heard death coming for the family, and the house itself might also have a warning about hidden damages in the beams or the floors or the paneling. So for ordinary people, that made the beetle hard to dismiss completely. Even when a doctor or a naturalist explained the insect, the explanation didn't take the uneasiness out of the room. A beetle in the wall was still a beetle in the wall. It still came with old wood and damp timber and hidden tunnels and a sound you might only hear when everything else had gone quiet. The supernatural meaning may have softened over time, but the little tap remained useful because it told people something was happening where their eyes couldn't see it. So, the Deathwatch beetle sits between science and omen. It's a real insect tapping inside the wood, and it became a household warning because people heard it when the house was quiet and often when death was already really close. The beetle made its small wooden signal, and human beings gave that signal a place in the language of death. The old belief behind the Deathwatch beetle isn't limited to the sick room. That's one place people heard it, and it's an important one, but the warning was bigger than that. The tapping meant death was coming. The cruel part was that it didn't tell you whose death, or when, or how. A family might hear the sound in the wall while everybody else in the house seemed perfectly well, and that made the omen worse. That's why this little beetle could frighten people so badly. The sound arrived without a name attached to it. It gave no target. It tapped from inside the wood, and the family had to live with the question. Was it for the old man coughing in the back room? Was it for the husband on the road? Was it for the father who hadn't come home yet? Was it for the child asleep upstairs? That uncertainty is where the omen did its real work. In a sick room, the meaning was obvious. Somebody was already close to death, and tapping seemed to confirm what everyone else had already feared. But in a kitchen or a parlor or a bedroom, the sound became a warning without a target. That's the version people remember from stories like Practical Magic, where the Deathwatch beetle is heard before the death of a husband. The sound comes first, and then the death comes later. The placement still matters, though, because the tapping could come from inside a wall, or inside a bedstead, or the old beams that held the room itself together. Unlike a bird outside or a bell down the road, it sounded like the house itself had started giving notice. Now, in folk belief, that makes a difference. A warning that comes from within the house feels like it belongs to the family, even when nobody else can see what's making that sound. And the rhythm made it worse. A single crack in the wood could be blamed on heat and expansion. A scrape might be blamed on a mouse, but a repeated tapping makes the mind count. Tick, tick, tick. It starts to sound like a little clock hidden in the timber. And once people connect a sound like that with death, every single tap feels like time being measured out. That's why the name Deathwatch works so well. It sounds like a watch ticking, but it also belongs to the act of watching for death. We talked about back then that people would actually keep watch over the sick and dying, where they would watch their breathing and their skin color, the way their hands felt, or the way they slept, or the way a fever reacted, and the way their face changed near the end. The beetle added another kind of watch. It was a hidden one, a tapping from inside the wood before anyone in the room knew exactly what it meant. Modern science tells us the beetles were communicating. They tap by striking their heads against the wood, and the sound can work as a call and an answer between beetles hidden in the same timber. The sound really was a message, but the message belonged to the beetles, not to people. But imagine hearing that before anyone knew about beetle courtship. Because let's be honest, nobody sitting in an old house at night is comforted by the phrase beetle courtship. One hidden creature taps, another hidden creature answers. The wood carries that sound through the room, and the people inside hear what seems like a conversation happening behind the wall. The beetles are trying to find each other, but the household hears death trying to find someone. That's why the sound worked on people. It had no visible body. It came from a hidden place. It repeated. It seemed to count. Until someone died or the days passed and nobody did, the family had to wonder who the tapping was for. So what did people do with that kind of sign? Well, most of the time they just watched. They paid attention to whoever was sick, whoever was old, who was away from home and traveling, who might be performing some sort of dangerous labor, or already under some cloud of trouble. They might pray, they might keep the lamp burning, they might send word to kin to come before it's too late. They might delay a journey they had planned, or sit up later than usual, or take the sound as a reason to check on someone they've been worried about. In folklore, that kind of response makes sense. An omen doesn't always hand you instructions. Sometimes it makes you stop ignoring what you already know. If the house starts tapping and your father is late, you send someone to look. If her husband's traveling, you say a prayer for the road. And if someone is ill, you watch them a little bit closer. And if nobody's ill, you still pay attention. But there's danger in that too. Once people believe they've heard a death warning, they can start fitting every event around it. A bad dream becomes proof, or a delayed letter, or a cough becomes proof, a horse stumbling, or a candle flickering, or a dog whining at the door. All of it seems to be lining up behind the beetle. That's how an omen can turn from warning into fear. The better magical reading is more disciplined, though. The tapping should make you look closer, but not surrender your judgment. Check the wood, check the room, check the people you're worried about. A sign doesn't have to be supernatural to be useful. Sometimes the house is telling you there's damage in the beams, not that someone's going to die. Sometimes it's your nerves that are telling you somebody needs to be taken care of because that damn beetle is ticking in the wall. Now, for magical workers, that's a rule worth keeping because the Deathwatch beetle isn't a charm, it isn't a curse, it's a warning sound. People heard death in it because it came hidden, repeated itself, and left them waiting for a name to be spoken. The work is to answer that warning with steadiness. You tend to the living, you check the house, pray for whoever's not there, and keep your head steady while you're finding out what's actually happening. Once people knew the Deathwatch beetle was a real insect, the old fear still had somewhere to go. It moved from the bedside into the parlor rafters and the roof beams to museum reports and the hands of people responsible for keeping old buildings upright. The little tapping that once made a family wonder who was going to die became a sound that told preservationists, we better go look inside the wood. Westminster Hall gives us one of the clearest examples. The roof was commissioned under Richard II in the 1390s, and it's still one of the greatest medieval timber roofs of Europe. We're talking about a roof large enough to make a modern person look up and wonder how in the hell they got all that oak in the air without cranes and hard hats, and somebody in a yellow vest yelling that the whole thing violates like 14 regulations. But in 1913, an inspection found the Deathwatch beetles had seriously damaged the roof beams. 4 of the 13 trusses were in danger of collapsing, and some cavities in the timber were large enough for a grown man to fit inside them. That detail takes the beetle out of superstition and puts it into the body of a building. For centuries, people heard the beetle as a death warning for a person. But at Westminster Hall, the warning was about the hall itself. The roof had been eaten from within, quietly and slowly over the years, while everyone below went on using the building as if the old wood would simply keep doing its job forever. Decay often works that way. If you give holes and dust and softened timber a little sound that seems too small to be taken seriously. Now, the repairs at Westminster Hall took years. Frank Baines oversaw the work from 1914 to 1923, reinforcing the wood with hidden steelwork and replacing decayed portions with new oak. The aim was to save as much of the original timber as possible while keeping the structure standing. In the distant past, when they heard the Deathwatch beetle, people might have resorted to prayer, but the modern response was scaffolding and tools and repairmen. The HMS Victory gives us another version of the same problem. The ship is famous for Nelson and Trafalgar, but one of the ongoing battles aboard her is against a beetle smaller than a fingernail. The infestation was officially identified in her timbers in 1932, and the National Museum of the Royal Navy still has to deal with the damage. The larvae tunnel through the wood, and over a long enough period, those small tunnels become a serious threat to historic timber. The HMS Victory research shows how far the story had traveled from Omen to science without losing the eerie center of it. Researchers now use imaging technology to look inside infected wood. They study how larvae moved through the timber, and they listen for the beetle sounds with acoustic equipment. So the old warning in the wall has now become data. The same kind of tapping that once made people cross themselves at night now helps experts figure out where the insects may still be active. And it gets stranger. In 2024, researchers connected with the Wellcome Sanger Institute, the University of Oxford, Cranfield University, and the National Museum of the Royal Navy to sequence the Deathwatch beetle genome for the first time. Some of the beetles came from HMS Victory. That means the little creature that once sounded like a countdown on the wall is now being studied down to its DNA. And the old question was, who was going to die? The modern question was, how does this beetle find damp, decaying wood, and how can we stop it from destroying what we're trying to preserve? The belief lasted because people could hear the sound, find the insect, and sometimes see the damage it left behind. A superstition can survive for a long time when it's attached to something that happens in the actual boards of a house or a hall or a ship. Even when the death part is no longer believed as much as it used to be, the warning part stays useful. If the wall is tapping, something is happening somewhere you can't see. So the afterlife of the Deathwatch beetle is almost a reversal. The old household heard the sound and feared death coming from the family. And modern preservationists hear it and worry about decay working through the wood. So science changed the explanation, but it didn't make the tapping harmless. It just taught people to listen with different tools. So the practical rule from the Deathwatch beetle is this. When you hear tapping in a wall, start with the wall. Don't start by deciding who is doomed. You get a flashlight, you check the wood, and you deal with the ordinary possibilities before the old stories get a hold of your nerves. The Deathwatch beetle earned its reputation because the sound came from a hidden place and repeated itself. In an old house, that's enough to make anybody uneasy, especially when the tapping seems to come from inside the boards or behind the paneling. So give the sound a real check. Look for small holes in the wood or find dust or little pellets near beams or furniture or damp timber or loose boards. And don't rule out mice or pipes or branches scraping the siding or anything else that could make a house talk after dark. If the sound keeps coming back and you see insect damage, then you call someone who knows buildings and pests. That's how you keep folklore useful instead of letting it run your whole house. So once the practical check is done, you can do a small settling work. We're moving back into magic now. This isn't meant to silence every creak or pop or groan in the house. A house has the right to make house noises. But this work is for settling the fright so it doesn't spread through the entire household. And what you're going to need is a flashlight, a pencil and a piece of paper, a small wooden spoon or a plain piece of untreated wood of some sort, a small dish, and a white cloth. And you sit near the place where the tapping was heard, preferably in daylight or early evening. Put the dish on the white cloth and lay the wooden spoon or piece of wood beside it. Write down the date, the room, the wall or the object, and the time you heard the sound, and be specific about it. Things like 3 taps in the east wall after midnight is kind of more useful than something creepy happened. So specific words, keep everything in order. We're being magical, but we're also approaching it with a lot of logic, like a scientist would. Then you tap the wooden spoon or the piece of wood you have gently against the dish 3 times and say, "If this is damage, let me find it. If this is a warning, let me understand it. If this is fear, let it leave the room." And then you leave the paper under the dish until morning. The next day, check the area again in better light. And if you find a real cause, like evidence of insects, you deal with it by calling the exterminator. But if you find nothing, fold the paper away from you and put it in the outside trash and thank it for doing its work for you. The lesson of the Deathwatch beetle is that a warning should send you towards care and not panic. You check the house, you check on the people you love, pray for the ones who are traveling or sick or grieving or out of reach. Then you look for the real source of that ticking sound. I'm Papa G, and this has been the Feral Folklorist. Next time, we're closing out Season 2 with Working with the Weather, Witches Who Called the Storm. We'll be talking about storm magic and folklore and around the world, from weather workers and charmers to witches accused of raising wind and rain and lightning. So until next time, when the wall starts tapping, check the wood before you start counting the dead. If you'd like to hear the After the Show episode where I go deeper into the folklore, spill a little extra dirt, and sometimes rant just a bit, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. You can find the official site for the podcast at feralfolklorist.com. And if you need spell supplies for any of the workings we talk about on the show, our metaphysical shop, Romangees Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at romangees.com.